The gunshot echoed across the frozen ridge just as Grace Catherine's horse reared, and she felt herself tumbling backward through the crystalline air. The world spinning white and red before her back slammed against the rocky outcrop, and everything went dark for a heartbeat. When her eyes fluttered open, crimson bloomed across the pristine snow beneath her head, spreading like spilled wine, and the December cold of 1883 bit through her wool coat with vicious teeth. Her mare had bolted, spooked by whatever fool hunter had fired into the mountains above Julian, California, leaving Grace stranded 3 miles from town with blood streaming from where her skull had struck stone. The metallic taste filled her mouth as she tried to sit up, but dizziness crashed over her in nauseating waves. Her gloved fingers came away red when she touched the back of her head, and fear, real and primal, clawed up her throat. She was 22 years old, and the thought of dying alone in the snow seemed impossibly cruel after everything she had survived to get here. The sound of hooves crunching through snow made her heart leap. Grace tried to call out, but her voice came as barely a whisper. Through the white dusted pines, a rider emerged, sitting tall on a bay gelding, his dark coat powdered with snowflakes. He spotted her immediately, and she watched his posture change from casual to urgent in an instant. Ethan Garrett swung down from his horse before the animal had fully stopped, his boots hitting the snow with purpose. He had been tracking a mountain lion that had taken 2 calves from his ranch when he heard the gunshot, and now he found himself staring at a woman bleeding into the snow, her honey-colored hair matted with red, her green eyes unfocused but fighting to stay conscious. "Easy now," he said, dropping to his knees beside her, his voice steady despite the jolt of alarm in his chest. "You are hurt bad, do not try to move." "My horse," Grace managed, her words slurring slightly. "The shot scared her, forget the horse." Ethan was already shrugging out of his heavy coat, then his wool shirt beneath, the December cold biting his skin through his undershirt. He did not hesitate, pressing the shirt firmly against the wound at the back of her head. The fabric turned dark almost immediately, but he held pressure, his other hand coming to cup her jaw gently, keeping her head still. "Look at me. Keep your eyes on me." Grace found herself staring into eyes the color of creek stone, gray, blue, and intense beneath the brim of his hat. His face was lean and weathered, probably late 20s, with a few days of stubble darkening his jaw. There was something inherently trustworthy in the set of his features, something that made her instinctively believe she was safe despite her vulnerability. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice deliberately calm though she could feel the tension in his hands. "Grace Catherine," she whispered, "from the boarding house in Julian. I know the place. I am Ethan Garrett. My ranch is south of here." He glanced at the blood-soaked shirt, then back at her face, assessing. "This needs proper doctoring. Can you ride with me? My place is closer than town." "I think so." But when she tried to sit up, the world tilted violently, and only his arm around her shoulders kept her from collapsing back into the snow. "All right, different plan." Ethan made a decision quickly, wrapping his coat around her shoulders before gathering her into his arms with surprising gentleness for a man his size. She was slender but solid, and he held her carefully as he stood, mindful of her head wound. "Just hold on to me." Grace found her arms circling his neck instinctively, her face pressed against his shoulder. Through the thin fabric of his undershirt, she could feel the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. He smelled of pine and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her feel, irrationally, like everything might be all right. Getting into the saddle with an injured woman was no easy feat, but Ethan managed it with practiced efficiency, settling her across his lap, one arm locked around her waist while the other held the reins. He kept the shirt pressed against her wound as best he could, tucking it between her head and his shoulder. "Stay with me, Grace," he said as he urged his horse into a careful trot. "Keep talking. Tell me why you were out here alone." "Foolish," she murmured, her words coming slower now. "Wanted to see the snow in the high country. We do not get much in town." Each word took effort, but she forced them out, sensing he needed her to stay conscious. "Came from San Francisco 6 months ago, teaching at the schoolhouse. A teacher." Something in his voice warmed. "That explains the proper way you talk. And you are a rancher." She could feel his muscles working as he controlled the horse, careful not to jostle her too much. "What explains the proper way you talk?" Despite the situation, Ethan felt his mouth quirk. "My mother was a schoolteacher herself. She did not tolerate lazy speech." The smile faded as he felt Grace grow heavier against him, her consciousness wavering. "Hey, none of that. Tell me about San Francisco. Big city like that must have been something." Grace forced her eyes open. The snow had stopped falling and patches of blue showed through the clouds. "Too big," she whispered. "Too many people who did not care if you lived or died. My father passed 2 years ago, mother last spring. I needed somewhere different. Julian seemed like a new start. And now you probably wish you had stayed in the city where women do not get thrown from horses in the middle of winter." His arm tightened around her, protective. "No." Her hand fisted in his undershirt, holding on. "I do not wish that at all." The Garrett ranch appeared through the trees like salvation, a sturdy house built of timber and stone with smoke rising from the chimney. Ethan rode straight to the porch, calling out before he even dismounted. "Sarah, Sarah, I need help." A woman emerged, dark-haired and capable-looking, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Ethan holding a blood-covered woman. "Lord have mercy. Bring her inside, quickly." Sarah Garrett, Ethan's older sister, had stayed to help run the ranch after their parents passed, and she took charge immediately, directing Ethan to lay Grace on the settee in the front room while she fetched water and clean cloths. She was 31 and unmarried by choice, having lost her fiancé to a mining accident years ago, and she poured all her considerable energy into keeping the ranch running smoothly. "Head wound," Ethan said tersely, carefully removing his blood-soaked shirt from Grace's hair. "Bad fall from her horse about 40 minutes ago." Sarah bent close, her fingers gentle as she examined the injury, parting the matted hair carefully. "Deep cut, but I think the skull is all right. The bleeding is slowing, which is good." She looked up at her brother, taking in his bare arms in the undershirt, the blood staining his hands. "Get cleaned up. I will tend to her." "I will ride for Doc Patterson." "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "The pass into town will be treacherous with this snow, and night is coming. She is stable for now. We will keep her warm, watch for fever or confusion. You can fetch the doctor at first light if needed." Ethan did not like it, but his sister's medical judgment was sound. She had nursed both their parents and half the ranch hands through various ailments over the years. "I will be right outside then." "Ethan," Sarah's voice softened, "you saved her life. Now let me do my part." He nodded reluctantly and stepped back, but not before his eyes found Grace's face one more time. Even pale and injured, there was something arresting about her, a delicacy combined with an underlying strength in the set of her jaw. He found himself deeply invested in her survival in a way that went beyond simple human decency. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness as Sarah worked, cleaning the wound with steady hands, stitching the deepest part with neat, practiced motions while murmuring soothing words. She helped Grace out of her blood-stained dress and into one of her own nightgowns, then wrapped her head in clean white bandages and covered her with quilts. When Ethan returned, washed and dressed in a fresh shirt, Sarah was sitting beside the settee, monitoring Grace's breathing. The lamp cast warm light across the scene, making it seem almost peaceful despite the circumstances. "She will be all right." His voice was quieter than usual. "I think so. But head injuries are tricky. The next day or so will tell us for certain." Sarah studied her brother's face, noting the concern etched there, the way his eyes kept drifting to their patient. "You did well, Ethan. If you had not found her when you did, she would have frozen or bled to death in that snow." He nodded, moving closer to look down at Grace. Her face was relaxed in sleep, long lashes dark against two pale cheeks, her breathing steady. Something in his chest tightened. "She is a schoolteacher from San Francisco." "Pretty too," Sarah observed with a knowing tone. "Though I suppose you noticed that." Sarah. But there was no heat in the warning. His sister stood, stretching. "I will make supper. You stay with her, make sure she does not wake alone and confused. That can be dangerous with head injuries." So Ethan found himself pulling a chair close to the settee, settling in to watch over a woman he had known for less than 2 hours, but who had already burrowed under his skin in an inexplicable way. Outside, true darkness fell and the temperature dropped further, but inside the fire crackled warmly and Grace slept on, unaware of the vigil being kept. She stirred near midnight, a small sound of distress escaping her lips. Ethan leaned forward immediately, his hand finding hers beneath the quilts. "You are safe. You are at the Garrett Ranch. I am Ethan. Remember." Grace's eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding them before memory returned. "The fall. You found me." Her voice was hoarse, and he reached for the glass of water Sarah had left, helping her take small sips. "I remember your horse, the ride here." "That is good, that you remember." Relief loosened the knot in his shoulders. "My sister Sarah patched you up. You needed stitches, but she thinks you will be fine. I am in your debt." Grace tried to sit up, but Ethan's hand on her shoulder stopped her gently. "You are in my guest room, and you will stay put until Doc Patterson says otherwise. I will fetch him at first light." His tone brooked no argument, but his touch remained careful. "Do you hurt anywhere besides your head?" Grace took stock of her body. "My back is sore where I hit. Some bruises, I think, but the head is the worst of it." She looked up at him, really seeing him now in the lamplight. His face showed the weariness of keeping watch, but his eyes were alert, concerned. "You used your shirt to stop the bleeding. That was quick thinking." "It was the closest thing to hand." He settled back in his chair but did not release her hand. "You scared me, I will admit. All that blood in the snow. I scared myself." She managed a weak smile. "Not how I planned to spend my Saturday." They fell into quiet conversation then, the kind that happens in the deep hours of night when normal social barriers seem less important. Ethan told her about the ranch, how his parents had built it from nothing, how he and Sarah worked it together with 3 hired hands. Grace spoke of teaching, of her 12 students ranging from 6 to 14, how she loved watching understanding dawn in their eyes when they mastered something difficult. "You miss your parents," Ethan observed, hearing it in her voice. "Every day." But the missing has gotten softer around the edges. Grace's thumb moved against his hand without her seeming to realize it, a small restless motion. "Being in San Francisco after they were gone, everything reminded me of what I had lost. Here, I can think of them and smile more often than I cry." "I understand that." His voice went rough. "My father passed 3 years ago. Heart gave out during Roundup. Mother followed 6 months later. Doc said it was pneumonia, but Sarah and I knew better. She died of a broken heart. They were fortunate to have that kind of love." Grace's eyes glistened. "Not everyone does." "No," Ethan agreed softly. "Not everyone does." Sarah found them like that when she came to check on Grace near dawn, hands intertwined, talking in low voices like old friends. She said nothing, just smiled to herself and retreated to start breakfast. Doc Patterson arrived mid-morning, brought by Ethan through snow that had frozen overnight into a treacherous crust. He was a grizzled man in his 60s with steady hands and a no-nonsense manner. After examining Grace thoroughly, asking her questions to test her memory and cognition, he pronounced Sarah's stitching excellent and the patient fortunate. No sign of serious brain injury, though you will have headaches for a while, young lady. You need to rest, no strenuous activity for at least 2 weeks, and someone should watch you for the next few days, make sure you do not develop fever or worsening symptoms. He looked between Ethan and Sarah. She can stay here, I presume. Of course, Sarah answered before Grace could protest. She is welcome as long as needed. I cannot impose, Grace began, but Ethan cut her off gently. You are not imposing. You need care and we have room. It is settled. The look in his eyes made her breath catch, something warm and protective that went beyond mere hospitality. So Grace found herself ensconced in the Garrett ranch house, installed in the guest room that had once belonged to Ethan's mother. Sarah brought her meals on a tray and sat to chat while she ate. Ethan checked on her constantly, bringing books from the family collection, stoking the fire in her room, asking if she needed anything with an attentiveness that made her heart flutter in unfamiliar ways. On the third day, she felt strong enough to sit in the front room, wrapped in quilts on the settee. Ethan settled in the chair opposite, ostensibly repairing a bridle but mostly stealing glances at her when he thought she was not looking. You do not have to stay inside on my account, Grace said, catching him at it. I know you have work to do. The hands can manage for a few hours. He set aside the bridle, giving up the pretense. Besides, I like the company. Do you not get lonely out here? Just you and Sarah and the ranch hands, Ethan considered the question. Sometimes, but it is a good life. Honest work, clean air, land as far as you can see. I never had much use for crowds or city noise. He paused. Though I will admit it gets quiet in the evenings. I imagine it does. Grace pulled the quilt tighter, not from cold but from something else, a awareness of him that seemed to grow stronger each day. Do you ever think about marrying, having a family of your own? The directness of the question surprised him, but he did not shy from it. I think about it. Hard to meet someone suitable out here, though. Most women want more than ranch life can offer, more excitement, more society. Not all women. Grace met his eyes steadily. Some of us find value in simpler things, community, purpose, room to breathe. Is that why you came to Julian? Room to breathe, partly, and partly running away, if I am honest. She looked down at her hands. In San Francisco, people had expectations. They thought I should marry well, use my father's connections even though he was gone. But I wanted to matter for what I could do, not who my family was. Teaching here, I matter. Those children need me. We need good teachers. Ethan's voice had gone soft. You are doing important work. So are you. Feeding people is about as important as it gets. They smiled at each other, and something shifted in the air between them. A recognition that what was growing here was not simply gratitude or proximity, but something deeper and more significant. Sarah watched their courtship unfold over the following days with satisfaction. She saw how Ethan's face lit when Grace entered a room, how Grace's eyes followed him when he moved, tracking him unconsciously. She heard them talking late into the evenings, sharing stories and dreams, their laughter mingling. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who had loved and lost, that something real was taking root. On the 7th day of Grace's stay, Doc Patterson returned to check her progress and pronounced her healing beautifully. You can return to town whenever you feel ready, Miss Catherine. though I would still avoid any horseback riding for another week at least, and take things easy." Grace nodded, but her heart sank at the thought of leaving. The ranch had come to feel like a haven, and more than that, Ethan had come to feel like home in a way she could not quite explain. The thought of going back to her small room at the boarding house, of returning to a life that no longer included his steady presence, filled her with unexpected grief. That evening, Ethan found her standing on the porch, wrapped in a shawl despite the cold, staring out at the snow-covered pastures turned silver by moonlight. He draped a heavier coat over her shoulders and stood beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Doc says you are well enough to go back to town," he said carefully. "Yes. But you do not want to." It was not a question. Grace turned to face him, and in the moonlight her eyes were luminous. "No, I do not want to. Is that foolish? I have only been here a week." "If it is foolish, then we are both fools." Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one calloused hand. "Grace, I know this is fast. I know it does not make logical sense, but I have not been able to think straight since I found you in that snow. The thought of you leaving, of going back to town, and me only seeing you at church on Sundays, it feels wrong. It feels wrong to me too." Her hand came up to cover his, holding it against her cheek. "Ethan, I do not know how this happened so quickly. Does it matter how it happened?" He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. "Stay. Not as a patient, but as someone I am courting proper. Let me do this right. Let me take you to the church social and the town dances. Let me call on you at the boarding house with flowers like a gentleman should. Give this a real chance." "Yes." The word came out breathless, full of hope and happiness and a future she had not dared to imagine a week ago. "Yes, I want that." Ethan kissed her then, gentle and reverent, his lips warm against hers. It was a first kiss, tender and exploratory, asking permission even as it gave promise. Grace melted into it, her hands fisting in his coat, and when they finally parted, both were breathing hard. "I should probably still go back to town tomorrow," Grace whispered, practical even in the midst of emotion. "People will talk if I stay longer, and I do not want to damage your reputation or Sarah's." "Or yours," Ethan agreed reluctantly. "But I will drive you in the wagon, and I will come calling the very next evening, and the one after that, and the one after that. I will look forward to it." She smiled up at him, radiant despite the healing wound still bandaged beneath her hair. Every single time, true to his word, Ethan appeared at the Julian boarding house the next evening with a bouquet of winter berries and evergreen boughs, the best he could manage given the season. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, greeted him with knowing eyes and led him into the front parlor where Grace waited, dressed in a simple blue wool dress that brought out the green in her eyes. They sat and talked, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Henderson's presence in the adjoining room about nothing and everything. When the clock struck 9, Ethan took his leave with obvious reluctance, but not before arranging to escort Grace to church on Sunday. The town noticed. Julian was small enough that any courtship was of general interest, but the schoolteacher and the rancher made an especially appealing story. The tale of how he had found her bleeding in the snow and saved her life with his quick actions spread quickly, gaining romantic embellishments with each retelling. At church that Sunday, heads turned when Ethan arrived with Grace on his arm and Sarah beaming behind them. They sat together in the Garrett family pew, and during the sermon on love and charity, Ethan's hand found Grace's beneath the cover of her shawl, their fingers intertwining in secret promise. After the service, the community gathered for the monthly social, and Ethan led Grace in dancing a respectable waltz, his hand firm at her waist, his eyes never leaving her face. They moved together naturally, as if they had been partners for years rather than days. "People are watching," Grace murmured, though she made no move to pull away. "Let them watch. I am courting the prettiest woman in Julian. I have nothing to hide." His smile was easy, confident in a way that made her pulse quicken, ranching and flattery. "You are a man of many talents. You have not seen anything yet." The promise in his voice made her blush, and she was grateful for the movement of the dance to cover her reaction. Over the following weeks, Ethan courted Grace with single-minded determination. He appeared at the schoolhouse to walk her home each afternoon, carrying her books and listening to her stories about her students. He invited her to Sunday dinners at the ranch, where Sarah cooked elaborate meals and then made herself scarce so the two could have time alone. He taught Grace to handle a rifle properly, standing behind her to adjust her grip, his breath warm on her neck as he guided her aim. She taught him to appreciate poetry, reading aloud by firelight while he listened with his eyes closed, absorbing not just the words but the musical quality of her voice. They rode together through the winter landscape, Grace on a gentle mare from Ethan's string, him watchful beside her on his bay gelding. He showed her every corner of his land, from the south pasture, where the cattle wintered, to the high meadow where wildflowers would bloom come spring. She painted pictures with her words of what she imagined it would look like in summer, in fall, and he found himself seeing his own land anew through her eyes. On Valentine's Day, a Tuesday in the middle of February, Ethan arrived at the boarding house with a small wrapped package. Grace opened it to find a carved wooden box, the lid inlaid with a delicate pattern of vines and flowers. Inside, nestled on velvet, was a locket of worked silver. "It was my mother's," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have liked you. Sarah and we want you to have it." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she lifted the locket, opening it to find a small space for a photograph or lock of hair. "Ethan, this is too much. It is not enough." He took the locket from her shaking fingers and fastened it around her neck, his hands lingering on her shoulders. "Grace, I know we have not been courting long by traditional standards, but I am sure. I have never been more sure of anything in my life." She turned in his arms, searching his face. "What are you saying?" Ethan took a breath and dropped to one knee right there in Mrs. Henderson's front parlor, taking Grace's hand in both of his. "I am saying that I love you. I am saying that every day I spend with you makes me more certain that you are exactly who I want to spend my life with. I am saying that I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to see you teaching our children to read. I want to grow old watching sunsets from the porch of the ranch house with you beside me." His voice went rough. "Grace Catherine, will you marry me?" Grace dropped to her knees in front of him, propriety forgotten, and took his face in her hands. "Yes, yes, Ethan Garrett, I will marry you. I love you so much it scares me sometimes, how fast and how complete it is." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Mrs. Henderson, peeking around the doorway, smiled and quietly withdrew to give them a moment of privacy. They were married 6 weeks later, on a bright March morning when the snow had finally melted and the first green shoots were pushing through the earth. The ceremony took place in the Julian church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Sarah stood up as Grace's maid of honor, having grown to love her almost sister over the winter. The ranch foreman, a weathered cowboy named Tom who had worked for the Garretts for 20 years, served as Ethan's best man. Grace wore a simple dress of cream silk that Sarah had helped her sew, with the silver locket at her throat and wildflowers in her hair. Ethan wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed, looking uncomfortable but impossibly handsome. When the preacher asked if he took this woman, his "I do" rang out clear and firm, echoing in the rafters. When Grace gave her vow, her voice wavered with emotion but never with doubt. The kiss they shared as husband and wife drew cheers from the congregation, and Grace laughed against Ethan's mouth, joy bubbling up irrepressibly. They walked back down the aisle hand in hand, and outside the church, the community had gathered to throw rice and offer congratulations. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, tables set up in the barn that had been swept and decorated with ribbons and lanterns. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, toasts that made the newlyweds blush and others that made them laugh. Sarah gave a speech that had everyone reaching for handkerchiefs, talking about how she had prayed for her brother to find the right woman and how grateful she was that Grace had literally fallen into their lives. As the evening wore on and guests began to drift home, Ethan pulled Grace aside, leading her out of the barn and toward the main house. The moon was rising, full and bright, turning everything silver. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I knew was possible, Mr. Garrett." She tilted her face up for his kiss, which he gave gladly, "though I will admit to some nervousness about tonight. We will figure it out together." His voice was gentle, understanding. "No rush, no pressure, we have the rest of our lives." True to his word, Ethan was patient and tender on their wedding night, guiding Grace through the intimate unknowns with care and reverence. He made sure her first time was about more than just physical union, but about emotional connection, about trust and vulnerability, and the joy of giving yourself completely to another person. When Grace finally fell asleep in his arms, thoroughly loved and utterly content, Ethan lay awake for a while, marveling at the gift he had been given. Sarah moved into the foreman's cottage a week later, insisting the newlyweds needed their privacy. She was only 100 yards away and still intimately involved in running the ranch, but she gave them space to build their marriage without an audience. Grace threw herself into being a rancher's wife while still maintaining her teaching position. She woke before dawn to help Ethan with morning chores, then rode into town for school, returning in the afternoon to help with whatever needed doing. It was exhausting but fulfilling, and she loved the rhythm of it, the way her life now had both intellectual stimulation and physical purpose. The first time she helped deliver a calf, she was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Ethan coached her through it, his voice steady, and when the wet, wobbly creature finally stood on shaking legs, Grace burst into tears. "That was incredible," she gasped, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I just helped create life." "You did." Ethan pulled her against him, not caring that they were both covered in barn muck. "You are incredible." Summer came, and with it long days of hard work and longer evenings of simple pleasure. They would sit on the porch as the sun set, Ethan's arm around Grace, discussing their plans for expanding the herd, for maybe building a new barn, for the future they were creating together. Sometimes they made love right there under the stars, the privacy of their isolated ranch allowing for such freedom. In August, Grace began feeling nauseated in the mornings. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope, but when her monthly courses failed to appear for the second time, she rode to see Doc Patterson. His examination confirmed what her heart already knew: she was pregnant. Grace told Ethan that evening as they sat down to dinner. She had planned something elaborate, some perfect way to share the news, but in the end, she just blurted it out. "I am going to have a baby, our baby." Doc Patterson confirmed it today. Ethan's fork clattered to his plate, his eyes going wide. "A baby, we are going to have a baby." At her nod, a grin split his face, brilliant and unrestrained. He was around the table in an instant, pulling her to her feet and spinning her around. "Grace, that is wonderful. That is the best news I have ever heard." You are happy." She knew he was, could see it written in every line of his body, but she needed to hear it. Happy does not begin to cover it. He set her down carefully, suddenly cautious. "Should I not have spun you? I did not hurt anything, did I? I am pregnant, not made of glass." But she smiled at his concern, at the way his hand had already come to rest protectively on her still flat stomach. "Though I may have to give up teaching when I start showing. The school board can be particular about such things. Then they are fools. But if you need to stop, we will manage fine." Ethan's thumb traced gentle circles on her belly. "When will the baby come?" "Doc says early March if his calculations are right." Grace covered his hand with hers. "We made this baby in the spring in all that newness. A spring baby born in spring." Ethan pulled her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I love you so much, Grace. Thank you for this gift." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through fall and into winter. Grace's belly swelled as the days shortened, and Ethan became comically overprotective, trying to prevent her from doing anything more strenuous than sitting still. Sarah had to intervene, reminding him that pregnant women had been working throughout human history, and Grace was healthy and strong. Grace taught school through November, finally yielding to the school board's discomfort when her condition became impossible to hide beneath loose dresses. She did not mind as much as she thought she would. The approaching birth consumed her thoughts, and she spent her days preparing, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, reading every book on childbirth and infant care she could get her hands on. On a cold night in early March, just as winter was loosening its grip, Grace woke to cramping pain low in her back. She lay still for a moment, timing the sensations before reaching over to shake Ethan awake. "It is time," she said simply. Ethan came awake instantly, fear and excitement warring in his expression. "Are you sure? Is it not early? Babies come when they want to come." Grace breathed through another contraction, stronger this time. "You need to get Sarah and send someone for Doc Patterson." The next 12 hours tested everyone's endurance. Sarah stayed with Grace, coaching her through contractions that grew progressively stronger and closer together. Ethan paced the front room, being thoroughly useless until Doc Patterson arrived and put him to work boiling water and fetching supplies. The sounds of Grace's pain nearly undid him, and twice, Sarah had to physically prevent him from bursting into the bedroom. Finally, as dawn was breaking, a new sound filled the house, the thin, furious cry of a newborn. Ethan was through the door before Sarah could call him, finding Grace propped up on pillows, sweaty and exhausted and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "A son," she said, her voice rough from hours of labor but glowing with triumph. "We have a son, Ethan." Ethan approached almost reverently, staring down at the red, wrinkled face of his child. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect fingers that were waving aimlessly. As he watched, his son's eyes opened, unfocused but seeming to look right at him. "He is perfect," Ethan breathed. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold him?" At Ethan's nod, Grace carefully transferred the baby to his arms, showing him how to support the head. Ethan looked down at his son, this tiny human who depended on him for everything, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. "Hello, little one. I am your father, and I promise you I will do everything in my power to give you a good life, to teach you to be a good man, to make you proud." They named him James Garrett, after Ethan's father, and the baby proved to have a healthy set of lungs and strong opinions about when he wanted to eat. Grace took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything, though the first weeks were exhausting in ways she had not anticipated. Ethan helped as much as he could, walking the floor with James at night when the baby would not settle. changing diapers with fumbling fingers, staring at his son with obvious adoration during every waking moment. Sarah was an enthusiastic aunt, sweeping in to take the baby when Grace needed to sleep, offering advice born of years helping neighbors with their children. The ranch hands, tough cowboys who had seen everything, turned to absolute mush around baby James, competing to see who could make him smile first. As spring turned to summer, and James grew from a helpless newborn to a chunky, happy baby who laughed at everything, Grace found herself marveling at the life she had built. Sometimes, holding her son while watching Ethan work with the horses in the corral, she thought back to that December day when she fell in the snow. She thought about how easily it could have ended differently. She could have frozen, could have bled out, could have never known this profound happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked one evening, finding her standing by the window with James asleep on her shoulder. "How lucky I am. How lucky we are." She turned to smile at him. "That fall was the best thing that ever happened to me because it brought me to you. I was just thinking the same thing." Ethan wrapped his arms around both of them, his family, complete and perfect. "Though maybe we can avoid any more head injuries in the future." "Agreed." Grace laughed softly, careful not to wake the baby. "I have everything I want right here. I do not need any more adventures." But life on a ranch was always an adventure. The years rolled by in a blur of seasons and milestones. James took his first steps in the barn. His first word was "da," and he proved to have his father's love of horses and his mother's sharp mind. When he was 2, Grace discovered she was pregnant again, and this time in the autumn of 1887 she gave birth to a daughter they named Emma Rose. Emma was different from James, quieter and more observant, with her mother's green eyes and a tendency to study the world carefully before acting. James adored his baby sister with protective intensity that made both his parents laugh. The house filled with noise and chaos and joy, toys scattered across floors, children's laughter echoing from room to room. Grace never went back to teaching at the schoolhouse, but she did not abandon education. She started teaching the ranch hands to read and write in the evenings, running informal classes at the kitchen table. Several cowboys who had gone their whole lives unable to read learned their letters from her, and the loyalty this engendered was absolute. She also taught her own children, starting them on books and numbers far earlier than most, determined they would have every advantage. Ethan expanded the ranch steadily, buying adjoining land when it came available, building the new barn they had dreamed of, increasing the herd until the Garrett Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the county. But he never let work consume him. He made time for his family, for Sunday picnics and evening stories, for teaching James to ride and holding Emma when she scraped her knees. Sarah eventually married a widower from town, a kind man with 2 half-grown children who had been courting her quietly for years. She moved into town but remained deeply involved with the ranch and in her niece and nephew's lives, showing up for birthdays and holidays, and any time Grace needed an extra pair of hands. In 1891, Grace gave birth to their 3rd child, another son they named Daniel. He was a surprise, coming 6 years after Emma, but he completed their family in ways none of them had anticipated. Daniel inherited his father's easy charm and his mother's love of learning, asking endless questions about everything he encountered. The children grew up wild and happy, running through the hills, helping with ranch work as soon as they were old enough, learning to ride almost before they could walk. Ethan taught them about the land, about responsibility and hard work. Grace taught them about literature and mathematics and the importance of kindness. Together, they raised children who were confident and compassionate, ready to face whatever the world might bring. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan surprised Grace with a trip to San Diego, their first time away from the ranch and children for more than a day. They stayed in a hotel by the ocean, walked along the beach, and remembered what it was like to be just the two of them. It was wonderful, but they both admitted to being relieved when they returned home to their noisy, chaotic, perfect life. "I missed them," Grace confessed as James, Emma, and Daniel swarmed them with hugs and stories of everything that had happened in their absence. "So did I." Ethan watched his children with obvious love. "But it was good to have you to myself for a few days. We should do it again in another 10 years. Grace leaned into him, his arm coming around her automatically. "Though by then James will be nearly grown. When did that happen? Too fast." Ethan's voice held a note of melancholy. "They grow up too fast. But growing up was what children were meant to do. James proved to be a natural rancher, taking on more responsibility with each passing year. At 16, he was doing the work of a full hand, and Ethan began to teach him the business side of running the operation, wanting his son to be prepared to eventually take over. Emma developed a talent for medicine, often riding with Doc Patterson when he made house calls, learning everything he would teach her. Daniel, the youngest, showed signs of being the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book or sketching the landscape around him. In 1898, as the century drew to a close, the family gathered to celebrate Ethan and Grace's 15th anniversary. Sarah was there with her husband and stepchildren, now fully grown with families of their own. The ranch hands, some who had been with them since the beginning, joined the celebration. Tables were set up in the yard, food piled high, music playing. Ethan pulled Grace onto the makeshift dance floor as the sun set, the same sun that had set over them so many times before. They swayed to the music, older now, marked by life and work, but with eyes only for each other. 15 years, Grace mused. It feels like both forever and no time at all. Best 15 years of my life. Ethan's hand tightened on her waist. "You know what I think about sometimes? That morning I went tracking that mountain lion. What if I had gone a different direction? What if I had not heard that gunshot? We might have missed each other completely. But we did not." Grace reached up to touch his face, the face she loved more with each passing year. "We found each other. You found me bleeding in the snow and saved my life, and in doing so, you gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. I think maybe you saved me too." Ethan's voice went soft. "I was lonely before you, Grace. I just did not realize how lonely until I had you to compare it to. You filled up all the empty spaces." They kissed, there in front of family and friends, and nobody looked away or made a joke because everyone could see the genuine love between them, the kind of love that deepened with time rather than fading. The years continued their steady march. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. James married a girl from town in 1902, a practical young woman named Clara who loved ranch life as much as he did. They gave Ethan and Grace their first grandchild in 1903, a boy they named Ethan Jr. And suddenly, Grace understood what her mother-in-law must have felt, watching the continuation of the family line. Emma shocked everyone by announcing she was going to medical school in San Francisco, one of the first women accepted to the program. It was expensive and difficult, but Ethan and Grace scraped together the money, proud beyond measure of their daughter's ambition. She graduated in 1905 and returned to Julian to practice alongside Doc Patterson, who was getting on in years and grateful for the help. Daniel left for university in 1906, planning to study literature and art. Ethan had worried his youngest son was too sensitive for the harsh world. But Grace had faith that Daniel's creativity was its own kind of strength. In 1908, on a warm May afternoon, Ethan and Grace stood on the porch of the ranch house they had shared for over 20 years, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. James and Clara's 3 children were joined by Emma's new baby, a girl, and the sound of their laughter was the sweetest music. "We did all right, did we not?" Ethan said, his arm around Grace's waist in the habitual gesture of decades. "We did better than all right." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "We built something good, something lasting. You know what today is?" Ethan's voice held a smile. Grace thought for a moment. "Is it our anniversary?" "No, that is next month. 25 years ago today, I found you in the snow." Ethan turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. 25 years since the best day of my life. The day I nearly died." But Grace was smiling, understanding what he meant. "The day I found you, the day everything changed." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I would live every hard moment again if it meant ending up right here, right now with you." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind, born of overwhelming emotion. "I love you, Ethan Garrett. After all these years, all these changes, I love you more now than I did that day you proposed. And I love you, Grace Garrett, my wife, my partner, my best friend." He pulled her close, and they stood there together, watching their legacy play out before them in the form of happy, healthy children and grandchildren. "Here is to another 25 years. At least," Grace agreed. "At least another 25. They stayed on the porch as the light faded, the same porch where they had shared so many moments over the years. First kisses and last worries, quiet conversations and loud celebrations. The ordinary and the extraordinary all woven together into the fabric of a life well lived. The ranch continued to thrive under Ethan's management, and increasingly under James's as well. The cattle bore the Garrett brand, respected throughout the region for their quality. The house rang with the sounds of family, always someone dropping by for dinner, always a reason to celebrate. Ethan and Grace grew older gracefully, their hair silvering, their faces weathering, but their love remaining as strong as ever. They still danced in the kitchen when no one was watching. They still talked late into the night, their conversations ranging from the profound to the mundane. They still reached for each other in sleep, seeking the comfort of familiar presence. In 1913, they celebrated their 30th anniversary with a party that drew people from across the county. Doc Patterson, now fully retired with Emma having taken over his practice, gave a toast about how he had worried that girl with the head injury might not make it. And look at her now, grandmother to 8, and showing no signs of slowing down. Sarah, gray-haired but still sharp, spoke about how she had known from the first day that Grace and Ethan were meant to be. James spoke of growing up with parents who showed him what real love looked like, giving him a model to build his own marriage on. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he stood and pulled Grace up beside him. "I am not much for fancy words," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "But I want everyone to know that this woman right here is the best thing that ever happened to me. She took a lonely rancher and made him into a husband, a father, a grandfather. She turned a house into a home. She brought light and laughter and love into every corner of my life." He turned to Grace, speaking directly to her now, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my miracle, Grace. 30 years ago, I found you in the snow, and in saving your life, you saved mine. Thank you for every day since. Thank you for our children, our grandchildren, this beautiful life we built. Thank you for choosing me." There was not a dry eye in the room as Grace kissed her husband, and the crowd erupted in applause. The years that followed brought both joy and sorrow, as all lives do. They lost Sarah in 1915, her heart giving out in her sleep. The grief was sharp, but Ethan took comfort in knowing his sister had lived to see him happy and had found happiness of her own in her later years. They lost Doc Patterson the following year, and Emma named her second daughter after him, a small memorial to a man who had meant so much to their family. But there were joys, too. Daniel married in 1917, choosing a vivacious artist who understood his creative spirit. He published his first book of poetry in 1918, and Grace cried when she saw the dedication. "For my parents, who taught me that love is the greatest adventure." More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with noise and life. Ethan built a swing set near the house, and on summer evenings, the yard would be full of children playing while the adults watched from the porch, continuing the tradition Ethan and Grace had started so many years before. In 1920, as they approached their 37th anniversary, Ethan noticed Grace moving more slowly, complaining of aches in her joints. She brushed it off as the natural consequence of age and a life of hard work, but he worried. When she fainted while helping Emma at the clinic, Ethan insisted on a thorough examination. Emma's face was grave as she delivered the news. Her mother had a weak heart, likely a condition she had carried for years, but which was now progressing. She needed to rest more, avoid stress, take life easier. Grace railed against the restrictions, hating feeling limited, but Ethan was firm. "We have been together for 37 years, he told her, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes boring into hers. "I am greedy. I want 37 more. So you are going to rest, and you are going to let people help you, and you are going to take care of yourself because I cannot lose you. I will not lose you." So Grace slowed down, reluctantly at first but gradually accepting the new pace. She spent more time sitting on the porch with her mending or a book, watching the ranch operate around her. Ethan cut back his own activities, delegating more to James, wanting to spend his time with Grace rather than out on the range. They fell into a new rhythm, quieter but no less meaningful. Morning coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise. Afternoons spent reading aloud or playing cards or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Evenings surrounded by family, grandchildren climbing on their laps, telling them stories of school and adventures. On their 40th anniversary in 1923, they renewed their vows in the same church where they had married, surrounded by 4 decades worth of family. Grace wore a simple dress, her hair completely silver now, but to Ethan, she was as beautiful as she had been at 22. He held her hand as they repeated the promises they had made so long ago, and when the preacher pronounced them still married, the gathered family laughed and cheered. That evening, alone in their room, Ethan helped Grace into bed and lay down beside her, careful not to jostle her. She curled against him, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. 40 years, she murmured. Who would have thought that girl in the snow would get 40 years of happiness? I would have. Ethan's arms tightened around her. From the moment I saw you, even bleeding and half frozen, I knew you were a fighter. I knew you were going to be all right. Because of you. Grace tilted her face up to kiss his jaw. You saved me, Ethan, in every way a person can be saved. They made love that night, slow and tender, a reaffirmation of decades of intimacy and connection. Afterward, Grace fell asleep in Ethan's arms and he lay awake for a while, watching her breathe, sending up silent prayers for more time. They got 3 more years. 3 years of watching grandchildren grow and great-grandchildren arrive. 3 years of sunsets and family dinners, and the quiet contentment of a long life well lived. Grace's heart grew progressively weaker, but her spirit remained strong, and she faced each day with the same determination that had carried her through everything life had thrown at her. In the spring of 1926, as the wildflowers bloomed across the ranch, Grace took a turn for the worse. Emma moved into the main house, monitoring her mother constantly. The family gathered, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, filling every room of the house that had seen so much life. Ethan never left her side, holding her hand, talking to her, reminding her of all their best memories. On a warm May afternoon, with the windows open and the scent of flowers drifting in, Grace opened her eyes and found Ethan's face. "I am tired," she whispered, her voice thin but clear. "I know, my love." Ethan lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers. "It is all right to rest. I do not want to leave you. You are not leaving me. You are going ahead to save me a place, just like you have done for the last 43 years. His voice cracked, but he kept going. "I will be along when it is my time, and we will have forever." Grace smiled, her beautiful smile that had captivated him from the beginning. "Promise." "I promise. I will find you just like I found you in the snow. I will always find you." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. "I love you, Ethan Garrett. Best decision I ever made, saying yes to you. Best moment of my life, hearing you say it." Ethan's tears fell freely now, and he did not wipe them away. "I love you, Grace. I will love you until the day I die and every day after." Grace's eyes drifted closed, her breathing growing shallow. Around the bed, their family gathered, James and Emma and Daniel and their families, all the children and grandchildren who existed because two people had fallen in love in the snow. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Grace Garrett took her last breath, surrounded by love, her hand still in her husband's. The funeral was one of the largest Julian had ever seen, the church packed with people whose lives Grace had touched over 4 decades. Emma delivered the eulogy through her tears, talking about a mother who taught her to be strong and compassionate, who showed her that women could be anything they wanted to be. James spoke of parents who had built something lasting, a legacy of love and hard work that would continue through generations. Daniel read a poem he had written for his mother, beautiful and heartbreaking. Ethan sat in the front pew, older than his years suddenly, hollowed out by grief, but surrounded by the evidence of the life he and Grace had built together. After the service, the family gathered at the ranch, and Ethan stood on the porch where he and Grace had spent so many evenings, and looked out at land they had worked together, at children and grandchildren who carried forward their love. He lived another 4 years, and though he mourned Grace deeply, he did not let grief consume him. He spent time with his grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandmother, making sure they knew how special she had been. He worked the ranch alongside James, teaching great-grandchildren to ride the way he had taught their parents. He sat on the porch in the evenings, and sometimes, in the twilight, he could almost feel Grace beside him, her head on his shoulder, her hand in his. In the summer of 1930, on a morning when the sky was impossibly blue, and the air smelled of hay and wildflowers, Ethan Garrett did not wake up. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Grace for over 40 years, and the family chose to believe he had simply decided it was time to go find his wife, to keep the promise he had made her. They buried him beside Grace, their headstones side by side, overlooking the ranch they had built. The inscriptions were simple. Hers read, "Grace Catherine Garrett, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she taught us to love." His read, "Ethan Garrett, beloved husband, father, grandfather. He taught us to give." The ranch continued, passed down through James and his children, kept in the family for generations. The house remained standing, witness to decades of love and life. And on winter days when snow fell on the mountains above Julian, People still told the story of the cowboy who found a woman bleeding in the snow and saved her life, and how that moment of compassion had blossomed into one of the greatest love stories their town had ever known.